Do you see that faint fuzzy patch of light? That's not a cloud. That is an island containing over 1 trillion stars. That is the Andromeda Galaxy. It's 2.5 million light years away, which means the light from this galaxy has travelled unimpeded through the vacuum of space for 2.5 million years, up until the point it hit the sensor of my camera. And now I've captured it.
When I was a practicing Seventh-day Adventist, one of the hardest issues for me to deal with was this kind of thing, and in general, the age of the earth, right? And I understand a lot of the typical complaints Adventists would give. Rules are too strict. Sabbath summers last too long. Hamburgers sure look tasty, but following the rules didn't really bother me. The rules are the rules, and I'm just one of those guys. And per the structure of the system, I was a sinner, by nature deserving of death, judgment, and the lake of fire. Those were the rules. All I had to do to avoid that, to walk the path toward salvation, was simply believe in Jesus as Messiah and submit to these minor sacrifices of convenience. Saturday morning cartoons or eternal life. It seemed like an easy enough trade, assuming you never zoom out from yourself or think about it much deeper, that is. And often that felt like it was discouraged anyway. Our inferior human brains shouldn't try to understand his higher ways. Honestly, I'm fairly certain if Seventh-day Adventism was just a list of do's and don'ts, I might still be one. But it's more than that. It's an unbending, interpretive lens that really only looks back on itself. It's contained within its own orbit. If you'll give me a few moments to explain. The Adventist interpretation, among other things, mandates that Earth and the planets in our solar system, at least, are no more than 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And that was all created word for word, point for point, just how Genesis 1 through 2 and even parts of Job describes that. And that viewpoint is not optional. It's not simply the majority opinion. It's a fundamental belief, literally. Number 6 of 28 to be exact.
But let me tell you the problem if you don't put literal there. If you don't put literal there and you just say a 7-day creation week, it can leave room for people to interpret the days of creation as long days.
That's right.
That's correct.
Now, some may argue, well, the word literal isn't in the Bible. Well, yeah, but it is literal. If you don't put literal there, the word literal isn't in the Bible. Just say a 7-day creation week. It can leave room for people to interpret the days of creation as long days.
That's
regardless of what other possible interpretations might exist for those same scriptures, all filled with poetic elements. The Adventist Church's divine interpreter confirmed their literal, historic nature. If Ellen says a day is a day, then that's what it is, because inspiration cannot contradict itself. And that's a view over which the church is constantly drawing a line in the sand.
Do not allow anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances, to negatively influence you to believe anything but Bible truth that tells us that this earth on which we are standing right now was created by God by His Word in 6 literal consecutive days just like we experience today recently.
Honestly, at the time the church was founded, when this became etched in stone, it was a perfectly natural stance to take. The Advent movement had already grown to its original apex, fallen apart after repeatedly failed prophecies of the end of the world, and reconfigured itself into something else, oddly enough by reevaluating their interpretations in light of new indisputable evidence. By the time America discovered its first almost complete dinosaur fossil. And that became a real tangible challenge to the understanding they had that hadn't existed before. The church was already 100 years old when we learned how to carbon date. scientific innovation the Adventist faith has no faith in, and the movement's inspired messenger, Ellen White, had already died before we found out that little blurry gas blob in our night sky wasn't a blob at all, but actually a giant collection of individual stars, another entire galaxy unrelated to our own, so big and so far away it takes 2.5 billion years for its light to get here, even though there had only been a few thousand years so far.
In the spirit of prophecy, which I believe was inspired just as God inspired all prophets, tells us that this earth was created about 6,000 years ago.
And God put it there as a sign for times and seasons, so it couldn't be any older than the earth. So I just couldn't get over that one. I could buy into all the pseudoscience presentations you wanted to show me about how a set of Goodyear tires have been carbon dated to millions of years old, or someone found a T-Rex holding an Iron Age hammer in its claws or something, but light years bothered me. I could accept that there were somehow 3 evenings and 4 mornings before there was a sun to rise and set, but there was something odd about even close stars like Alpha Centauri, the closest to our planet. Closest, yes, but still being so far away that Adam and Eve wouldn't have seen it for 4 years. No evidence that that star was there at all for 4 years. They'd have only seen maybe a dozen stars in their first 10, maybe 10,000 by the time they turned 100. It's odd enough that these balls of light were intended for signs and seasons and days and years, but odder still that system wouldn't have been helpful at all for a good century or so. But in the back of my mind, every time Andromeda would come up, I'd think, we still shouldn't be able to see that for like another 2.5 billion years. And while I heard the whole apologetic of God creating light in transit so it didn't have to travel the original piece of time, like almost all negotiations of this sort, it only opens up more questions. So while Ted Wilson would argue,
why would you keep the seventh-day Sabbath literally if God was telling you a big fable and story and was fooling you?
He would also have to concede that apparent age and distance is an attempt to fool you. Like, why is God creating the illusion of age and distance as an additional test of your faith? If he can do anything, then he could have just created stars as a thing that can be smaller and closer so as not to challenge a historic reading. So what is he gaining by not doing that? Why add this illusion of age and space-time into the mix? As if maintaining faith in an omnipotent power over all of the universe contained within a man who not only came back to life, but also successfully launched himself into unassisted space travel and exited our observable dimension while maintaining telepathic radio contact with everyone, isn't enough to ask already? He just decided to go ahead and work in a couple of extra seeds of reasonable doubt that would only trigger after we used a considerable amount of intelligence and intuition that an all-powerful creator God had to expect and intend for us to use. Why? Again, a highly discouraged question to ask. Why is it so much easier to see that other people have interpretations, made interpretive choices and negotiations?
It can leave room for people to interpret the days of creation as long days,
while convincing ourselves we're not doing that. And why did we decide it makes more sense that these are the kinds of games God would play than just asking ourselves if we'd been looking at it wrong and haven't consistently been doing it, and that all we have done is been biblical? For more thoughts on that, by the way, you might want to find a piece I'll have here on the Substack called Biblical is a Weird Term. I think you'll like it.